Hello and welcome to a conversation on the Daily Bern. I'm your host, Eric Miller, joined today by an awesome attorney and advocate, a fighter for justice on the climate front, one of the co-founders of the Climate Defense Project, Ted Hamilton. How you doing, Ted?
Thanks, Eric. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, thanks for taking some time to talk with me. I have someone that's helping me book these, my friend Diane, and she discovered your organization. She said, "Would you want to talk to these guys?" And I was like, this is incredible. This is exactly who I want to talk to. I read through your site, and what you guys are doing is absolutely amazing. And I want to pull up your site and get people involved and so forth. Climate Defense Project. You're one of the co-founders, also a staff attorney. Let's just start at the beginning. Can you talk about, I guess, maybe the mission and then how the group founded?
Sure. So basically, the mission of Climate Defense Project is to be a legal wing of the climate movement. Basically, we see ourselves as climate activists who happen to be lawyers. And as is the case with lots of social movements, it's tough to find legal counsel. It's tough to find cheap legal counsel. So we set ourselves up as a nonprofit to largely at the beginning try to help out some friends we knew who were always in need of lawyers. And out of that grew this mission to be attorneys for people who are committing civil disobedience in the name of the climate, and also teach people about how the legal system interacts with the problem of climate change, how activists can use the legal system or they might encounter the legal system through their activism, basically be a legal resource for people advocating for climate solutions.
Amazing. And yeah, I want to ask about, you have sort of planks on your website, and I want to ask about some success stories and so forth. So as I mentioned, you're an attorney. So this came out of, like, were you college friends with the other co-founders? Like, how, talk a little bit more about that if you could.
Yeah, so we all met in law school, and we actually were involved with the fossil fuel divestment movement on our campus. So we got involved with trying to convince this big university to pull its funding out of fossil fuels. And we actually decided, since we were the law students in the group, people were doing sit-ins, marches, petitions, all that kind of thing. Our skill set was obviously around legal writing, legal research. We decided to sue the school and see if we could make this a legal fight too. As anticipated, we didn't win that court battle, but it was a lot of fun to try out some new ideas to kind of open a different organizing front for the campaign. And out of that, we decided, this is what we wanted to do. We knew people who needed lawyers. This was around 2016 when, Keystone XL was still in the news. There were a lot of pipeline fights going on across the country. Yeah. So we basically tried to figure out what it would be like to open our own shop, essentially. And, we wanted to be a nonprofit so that we wouldn't be worried about fees, had to figure out how to fundraise and all that kind of thing. But as soon as we graduated, we basically opened up our little office and kind of hit the ground running, and had some small group of activist friends who we were representing.
Excellent. And what's the footprint now? I'm assuming it's growing nationally.
We work, in a lot of different places. So that we started off sort of on the East Coast. We're based in Berkeley right now. It's still just the three of us, three staff attorneys, the original co-founders, myself, Kelsey Skaggs, and Alex Cherry. But given the nature of the fossil fuel infrastructure in the country, as you know, there's pipelines kind of cutting across everywhere in the country on lots of different places. But a lot of the resistance we've seen to fossil fuel infrastructure has been in very far-flung places. So from, Portland, Oregon to Standing Rock to Minnesota, we try to go to where those fights are and represent people where they're confronting directly the fossil fuel system, which means that, we have to work with local attorneys, and we need their expertise basically to figure out what these local courts are like. We only have bar licenses in a few states. So our model is kind of, we go to where the problem is, and then we find good local attorneys, some other climate movement attorneys, and try to put together legal teams in each of those different places.
Amazing. And as that, I'm assuming you're also always putting out the call for other attorneys in different states and so forth, right? Like you said, in terms of, getting coverage of who's barred and not, right?
Yeah, there's one group in particular we've worked a lot with, Civil Liberties Defense Center out of Eugene, Oregon. They're a great, they're an organization that's been around a lot longer than we have, who do a lot of really good work with environmentalists. We've paired with them in a lot of places. And then we do try to find good local counsel who can help us out in places like Montana. But one thing we're also very attentive to and we want to help out with is recruiting attorneys into the climate movement. So
Right.
we hear from tons of people who have been in the legal game for a really long time, but they're worried about the state of the planet and they want to figure out what they could do. So we do like continuing legal education trainings, for example. We put out some law review articles or training materials for attorneys. So not just in our own cases, but we want to help spread this kind of knowledge about how you can use the legal system to advocate for these tools, and also particularly in the area of protest defense. There's a lot to learn. We have a lot to learn from criminal defense attorneys, and we have some things to offer in terms of how to get the climate issue and civil disobedience into a courtroom.
That's so great. Yeah. So just two quick things. We got a nice little comment. Sky loves you as much as they love AOC. That's a pretty good pretty good crowd to be in. I wanted to share your website. So so to get people involved, is climatedefenseproject.com. Is it .com or .org? .com, right?
.org, yeah.
.org. Okay. Yeah, so people can donate there. Like you said, there's tons of resources there. One thing I want to focus on in talking to you is these sort of four sort of pillars of, your outreach and stuff. So, I'll kind of delineate those a little bit, but, of course, please make a donation. Like Ted's saying, you can get involved if you're an attorney. If you know an attorney, share this video, right? Build the network, help build the network, right? So let's kind of go through these four things. And I'll just prompt you to speak on them, right? So the first one is, making sure you know your rights. You're talking about, protesters and so forth. Can you talk about, what you do in this space and, maybe even some tips or whatever for anyone watching?
So this basically has to do with know your rights trainings for people who are interested in either protest marches, civil disobedience, whatever the engagement with the movement might be. The cards tend to be stacked against people who are expressing dissent. And so it's important for people to know everything from what you might expect in a typical police encounter. What are your Fourth Amendment rights against search and seizure? What should you be looking out for in particular places, because the law changes lots of times around what police are going to say, what they're going to demand during a protest, how you should respond. Often we have conversations about what's the line between arrestable and non-arrestable conduct. So that's kind of some typical good like protest law trainings we try to offer to people so that they feel like they have the knowledge when they go out there to figure out whether they want to cross the line into civil disobedience or know what laws hold the police back. It also goes beyond that to, let's say you do get arrested. Let's say you get involved in the legal system. What's that process going to look like? What are the different stages of a court case, of a trial? And we also try to do some work around new ideas around how climate change and the law interact. There are, pretty exciting ideas around things like the public trust doctrine or the rights of nature. Those aren't necessarily relevant to someone marching down the street in New York City talking about 2 degrees centigrade, but it's important for people to understand how much those ideas influence what a judge might do, and also what are some new possibilities for pushing the boundaries of existing environmental and climate law.
Could you just nutshell define those two things you mentioned, rights of nature?
Yeah. So the rights of nature is something that we still don't really have in the United States. Some people are trying to advocate for this. It does exist in some other countries, largely in Latin America. It's the idea that just like, corporations are considered legal persons now, they can donate to political campaigns. Lots of other things have a legal identity or a legal subjectivity. There's a movement to try to make ecosystems, animals, rivers, also bearers of rights. So this is a really early stage idea, but the hope is that if there's that kind of legal protection for non-humans, it might be easier to implement some of the kind of conservation priorities we want to see. And then the public trust doctrine is something that we do have a lot more developed in the United States. The idea is basically natural resources belong to the public in general as a trust. and the government is the trustee that's supposed to maintain things like the atmosphere for the public good. And so, what a lot of creative lawyers have been trying to do is argue that the government has a trust responsibility. It can't just let CO2 pump into the atmosphere, because that atmosphere belongs to everybody. And the way that's intersected with some of our protest litigation or protest cases is if somebody, ostensibly breaks a law by, let's say, trespassing on an oil production site. One argument we could make is that they're enforcing the public trust. They're acting in the public good to defend the atmosphere, and so that should be kind of a countervailing interest against whatever the harm might have been that their little minor act of trespass could have caused to the oil company.
Right. Are there any precedents in that area? Like, has that been used successfully?
So we're not totally sure how much of an influence it's had in our own cases, because it's something we include in our briefing along with a whole bunch of other constitutional and criminal arguments. Right. There have been a lot of states where there's been some incremental progress in using this public trust idea to either force kind of like changes in rules about how a state is regulating emissions. Right. There's also been a big effort by a group called Our Children's Trust out of Oregon to sue the federal government over exactly this question. They recently lost out in the Ninth Circuit in Oregon last year in this big, it's called the case of the century, Our Children's Trust climate case. So it's a little unclear where exactly that's going to be going, but like nature rights, there's really a lot of momentum towards this kind of like next generation of environmental law. So one thing we always like to say is, the law is not going to change unless you try to change it. And every progress we've seen, at least on the legal front, has always started off with a string of defeats. You can take civil rights as an example. Jim Crow was the law of the land, and people sued over that and tried to change that for decades and decades. And once it finally happened, it seemed very obvious and very logical. But with environmental law and climate law, I think we're still at one of those early stages where, in the year 2100, people are going to look back and say, of course, there's a public trust. Of course, nature has rights, but we've got to build that system. Yeah.
So that moves to the next thing, which is putting climate change on trial. Can you talk about, hit on it here, but, a little bit more going into that, what are your efforts, and, are there any success stories you want to share?
The main legal idea we've been working on is something called the climate necessity defense. And this is a defense that's used by protesters to argue that what they did was justified and that they should be acquitted of whatever charges they're facing. It's usually something like disorderly conduct or trespass, because the ultimate result of what they were doing was better for society than letting business as usual proceed. So the big example here is a case called a group of clients called the Valve Turners. And what they did in 2016 in response to a call for action from the Standing Rock camp was they went to sites in 4 states and simultaneously shut off the oil pipelines that were carrying all the tar sands oil via pipeline into the United States. And they managed to shut it off for a day, which represented something like 15% of the crude oil coming into the United States. Yeah, it was a fantastic action. It was really an example of normal people can intervene and do something direct to try to address the actual source of carbon emissions. They went into court, and with us and some of these other attorneys representing them, had to argue to a judge that they should be able to present this climate necessity defense, which requires lawyers and clients to show proof that what they did wasn't that dangerous, what the oil company was doing was really dangerous, and that it was reasonable for them to assume that by taking this action, they were actually going to be helping the public, helping society. There are a lot of success stories in that case. It's actually between the 4 states, there were a ton of different outcomes. Michael Foster in North Dakota, for example, one of the Valve Turners, he ended up serving prison time for that action because he was never allowed to present his necessity defense in court. On the other hand, in Minnesota, the clients, the Valve Turner clients, were able to partially argue their necessity defense. There's a lot of kind of back and forth in the court, but they walked out free. We got a couple of court opinions from a legal side of things, which was the big win, where we had appellate judges saying, yes, climate necessity defense is real. Defendants can use it. It's reasonable to think that at least a jury might agree with these people. So we're hoping to kind of expand and build on those big court rulings. We want this to be a kind of tool that people can use when they're undertaking similar types of actions. And again, if we kind of take a step back and look at, what's the point of somebody being able to make this sort of argument? Well, we would hope that these pipelines don't continue to run. We hope that this dangerous fuel isn't just taken for granted and given the sanction of the law, which is the situation we're living under right now. So this is kind of a little legal tool that could allow people to take action on their own, force the kind of future they want to see, turning off pipelines, for example, or whatever the other action might be. And then you turn it over to a jury and ask them, do you agree or not? And if they agree, you can start to imagine how kind of a whole groundswell of opposition to the fossil fuel status quo might start to grow.
Right. Yeah, I was going to ask about that. I imagine even with those victories, those tiny victories in those courts, I imagine the other side sees that as a significant threat and throws infinite resources at it. I'm imagining every caricature in every environmental law movie, right? Dark Waters and so forth, right? How real is that? Have you felt that?
So the threat is really real. And I mean, we as attorneys do not bear the brunt of that. We're in this privileged position where we have some cover as professionals and as attorneys. We're not the ones taking the action, but it is getting dicey for a lot of these defendants, a lot of these activists who are on the front lines. You spoke about industry throwing resources against this thing. That's certainly true. In our cases, we've seen, Chamber of Commerce, groups like that intervene, try to file briefs to shut this down. There's a lot of collusion between industry and police forces and prosecutors. Different oil groups have brought lawsuits against defendants, accusing them of things like terrorism or drug running, conspiracy to try to drain their time and resources to have to fight those court battles.
Right.
There's a lot of surveillance. We saw that at Standing Rock, and that continues where there are police infiltrators, a lot of people going through the personal lives of people who are taking this action. And one of the scarier developments in the last few years has been anti-protest bills. So in many states across the country, we've already got legislation that is really clipping the wings of activists by either saying that targeting fossil fuel infrastructure or even talking about it, campaigning against it, is a special sort of felony, which has obvious First Amendment implications. Going after people who might donate on a Facebook page to a campaign like this. And one of the unfortunate outcomes of the Capitol riot actually has been a growing consensus among a lot of lawmakers for this type of anti-dissent legislation. So out of well-founded fears about domestic security, as we saw after 9/11, there's going to be a lot of blowback that brings in, movements for Black lives, environmentalists, immigrants' rights advocates. That just makes it a lot easier for prosecutors and the court to come down really hard on people who are making these kind of statements, taking these kinds of actions.
Yeah, and of course they'll name it something like the Peaceful Act, or like the patriot. How are you not a patriot? How could you possibly oppose this? Right? They'll name it something Orwellian, and yeah. So the next one on your sort of agenda items is connecting attorneys with communities and campaigns. Can you talk about what role you play? And you said you have a finite group of attorneys on staff, but then you find local attorneys, and how's that process work? Can you talk about that, Bullet?
Well, we really lean on the groups that we work with a lot here. So we tend to work with really amazing organizers who have their feet on the ground in tons of different places in the country. So through their networks and through some of our networks, we try to build those communities and share that legal knowledge, both with attorneys and with non-attorneys. So kind of overlaps with the knowing your rights kind of stuff, but also letting people know that there are potential courses of action in court that they could take. But we try to do trainings and talks with lots of attorneys and build up a roster of attorney referrals. So we have an attorney referral network, so that if we get queries from activists around the country, we've got some people kind of on speed dial that we can reach out to quickly, who we know are environmentalists themselves, care about the climate, or have some special expertise in this kind of case. And that can extend a little bit beyond the climate movement too. So we hope to build this kind of resistance type of law in such a way that people who are not just involved with climate campaigns can assert the necessity defense or something like that. And then we put up some resources on our website to give people some of the legal knowledge about what the law looks like differently in each state, how you might mount a necessity defense, things of that nature. And this kind of overlaps with, the fourth point that's on there that you're showing right now, developing legal resources for the climate movement. It all kind of blends together. Through our litigation, through our court work, we've done a lot of briefing, and we don't want to be proprietary about a lot of the research we do. We want to share that with other attorneys and show them how a case could be brought. For people who aren't attorneys themselves, kind of explaining what the court process looks like. Another really important aspect of these cases is expert witnesses. So we've built up a group of scientists, social scientists, political experts who can come into court and explain what global warming is, or talk about why these defendants, these activists, reasonably believe that civil disobedience was the only course of action that they could be taking to try to address the climate crisis.
Right. Boy, that's incredible. So it's climatedefenseproject.com. There's tons of resources, like Ted was just saying, even for a layman like me, it's awesome information out there. This is obviously a global fight. Do you have any connections? I always think of Brazil and so forth. Like, do you have any connections globally? Because this is a global fight.
It really is. Yeah. So law is extremely different in every country, but on this climate necessity defense prong, there's some version of that in most countries. Some type of what's called a justification defense, where you're trying to justify ostensibly criminal conduct. So we've talked with attorneys in Canada, Australia, France, Britain, who are, trying to bring similar cases. The criminal systems are quite different in each place, and actually a lot of other countries are a little more advanced when it comes to some of these protest law topics. Right. But it goes along similar lines, trying to share briefings, trying to learn from their court cases, read those court opinions, and see what those look like. In Latin America in particular, we've learned a lot from mass mobilizations, largely by indigenous groups who have been doing versions of what we saw at Standing Rock for a really long time. And so there are a lot of attorneys down there who have a lot of experience dealing with governments that are, cozy with the fossil fuel industry, right, and trying to figure out how you not just assert something like the necessity defense or something like a First Amendment right to dissent, but also talk about indigenous rights to territory or the importance of ecosystems as a basis for life. So I really feel like we're learning more from other folks around the rest of the world than we are instructing anybody, because in a lot of ways, the United States is behind in this. And especially when we come to things we were talking about earlier, nature rights, things of that nature, it's going a lot faster in a lot of other countries. So it's important for us to, stay attuned to those things, because we've got a pretty conservative court system in this country. We've had a lot of conservative legislatures and Congresses, and we're pretty behind the ball on making our legal system catch up to climate policy, let alone climate policy that's realistic for averting the most extreme disasters.
Right. So which countries are sort of ahead of the game that we can sort of model somewhat after, the necessity, like their versions of it in various other countries, like who's really leading the curve, and how far behind are we really? Are we, at the 80th percentile? Like, are we better than most, or how,
Well, I think sometimes you need to actually distinguish between what the letter of the law is and what the application of the law or legal culture might be. So in many places in Western Europe and in some Latin American countries like Argentina in particular, there's good written law about rights to protest, and there have been some really monumental court opinions that have recognized the right of people to protest and have let people walk free after even, pretty violent confrontations with state authorities over protecting their territory or defending the environment. Those sometimes tend to be isolated examples. So there are tremendous problems in the United States court system. The criminal legal system is no friend of a criminal defendant by any means. And we have a huge gap between our written law and the applied law. But one thing that is a little better off in the United States is due process, or at least the expectation that you might get somewhat consistent rulings across court systems or from judges, whereas more blatant corruption or more overt problems in criminal process tend to crop up in some other countries. So sometimes it can be quite hard, to compare just what a legal brief says versus what it actually looks like to be an activist on the ground. Another big problem in a lot of these places I'm discussing is violence against environmental activists, which often goes unpunished. We have that problem here too, but nowhere near as severe as in some other places. Speaking about climate law and environmental law generally, though, kind of expanding beyond just the criminal protest context, I would say, again, Latin America is really leading the charge, and in particular, Colombia. They've had some opinions in recent years recognizing like the Amazon biosphere, for example, as a legal subject, integrating some indigenous communities into development planning, and basically articulating this idea that rights don't just protect humans. The law isn't just there to help economic interests and to promote economic activity, but that there are social rights and cultural rights, and that you can't allow this sort of conduct, pollution, without impeding people's right to flourish or their ability to flourish. Right. And we tend not to see that kind of language from U.S. courts.
And has that been used successfully to stave off any negative forces from the fossil fuel industry, whoever? Like, has that been used in Colombia, let's say?
I'm sorry, you were cutting out a little bit there. I just wasn't able to catch the.
Yeah, I was asking if that has been successfully applied. You said there's a gap between the letter of the law and the application, right? So, that sounds amazing. Has it been implemented?
It's, I think it's actually a little early to tell, and I'm certainly not the expert in Latin American context. I do know in Ecuador, that was the first national constitution to recognize rights of nature as a constitutional provision. And I think there's been a mixed bag. So we're starting to see some judges who are learning these ideas, starting to apply them. But there have been a lot of cases where judges will do kind of a balancing act between, okay, there are nature rights, but there's also, a corporation's right to develop, or their private property rights. And so it's still pretty early to tell. A lot of these ideas are really fresh and really new. So the implementation problem is a big thing. We also have to recognize that, no country exists in isolation. I think this is kind of part of your question, but no one can tackle the climate crisis, of course, on their own. And especially countries that are not as economically powerful, politically powerful as the United States. They can generate lots of very exciting legal ideas, but it's not just a battle of the law. So long as there's this tremendous demand for fossil fuels in our country, and so long as we're not doing our part as one of the world's superpowers, at least, to make sure there's very strict environmental governance around the world, it's not like you can really, just start in any country and try to start this fresh. We need really comprehensive changes in, I would say capitalism, but whatever you might want to call it, we need to reorganize a lot of global systems, and the law is a piece of that. It's a necessary, but not a sufficient condition.
Yeah, here. Do you feel with these victories on a global scale versus the impending, like you said, sort of Patriot Act 2 coming from the riot and so forth, do you feel that it's this one step forward, two steps back, or like how optimistic are you that we're making progress in a longer term sense?
I would say I'm pretty pessimistic, unfortunately. It's hard to know, though. I'm no Cassandra. It's really hard to offer any sort of prognosis. And there have been times when I'm really gratified by the progress we're making.
Right.
We're still coming out of the Trump hangover, right? So I think the pessimism comes from those 4 years where some stuff was done under Obama, for sure. Certainly not at the scale that we needed to keep the climate crisis in check, although I don't think we can keep it in check anymore. But then we took more than 2 steps back, for sure. And we see the forces of, the fossil fuel status quo organizing and learning where the challenges are. So to take Standing Rock as an example again, oil companies freaked out after that, and a lot of state governments freaked out after that, and we've seen a huge uptick in surveillance in response to that. That's going to make protest a little more difficult. It's going to make those legal battles a little more difficult. The Supreme Court, to stay on the legal side of things, is as conservative as it's been in a very long time. Right. So any of these bigger scale environmental law ideas that we're talking about, if they need to go up to the Supreme Court, it does not look good there for a long time. So those are reasons for pessimism. On the other hand, movements like Sunrise, the Our Children's Trust Group I mentioned before, there's a lot more organization in the climate movement than there ever has been. And there's certainly a growing public consensus that this sort of action and agitation is necessary. That's good for what it is. The institutional barriers are pretty strong, and, they don't show immediate signs of cracking. But again, I'm not, nobody's really going to know what's going to happen. And I think the best we can do is to keep our tools at hand for when that moment comes. I mean, I think a lot of times the real momentum shifts are unpredictable. And so you got to be ready for that moment when there is an opportunity to radically change policy or radically change the law, or all of a sudden a bunch of people will come out to the street, or, like we saw in this past year around racial justice protests. No one really predicted that. But if you don't have some of these legal ideas at the ready, or have some crazy policy ideas like the Green New Deal to implement when the time comes, then you're not going to be able to make change. So no matter what the sky looks like, if it's cloudy or sunny, that's kind of our job to do right now. And then we'll see what happens.
Right on. Yeah. And it's unfortunate, but it feels like we're at a tipping point because, I had a couple city council candidates on the last couple of days from Wisconsin, and they're in conservative areas, but flooding doesn't care if your house is red or blue, so to speak, right? And what just happened in Texas, I'm sure that's eye-opening for a lot of people so it feels like we're at a tipping point. Like you said, there is a momentum there, and what's the old quote, 99% preparation and 1% inspiration, or whatever, right? So from your lips to God's ears, hopefully, right?
Yeah, well, I hope so. It's got to happen at some point. We need the tipping point. There are good tipping points and bad tipping points. We've gone through too many bad tipping points in the Earth system. So I think that's coming on the social side of things.
Yeah, here. So it's climatedefenseproject.com. Please go make a donation. Go through the resources. If attorneys that would be interested in this, connect them and so forth. Share this video, like your socials. There's lots of ways to support. Any other practical ways that anyone watching this can get involved? Do you have a newsletter? Do you have mechanisms to volunteer? How can people help?
Yeah, we do have a newsletter. You can sign up on our website. We've got Facebook, we've got Twitter. So check those things out. We announce every so often we've got some appearances like this, or new resources that are coming out. We're not a climate campaign ourselves. We help out with climate campaigns, but the best way to get involved is to check out things like Sunrise, things like 350, Extinction Rebellion. Those groups are everywhere now. So it's been a tough time with people being stuck at home, I know, but as soon as that opens up, it's important for people to get out and take action. And that's what I think people in power really notice. And that's what's going to make a difference.
Yeah, here. And as things heats up, the opposition will get stronger and their pockets will get deeper. And, we need more people on our side. So, well, I appreciate what you do. It's absolutely incredible. Your organization is spectacular. Honored to have had this conversation with you. And, thanks for all the work you've done here heretofore. And, keep fighting a good fight, my friend. Feel free to come back anytime. If there's a news story, something you're working on, you have my email. You have a platform here anytime you want to utilize it. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Jack. I appreciate you having me on. This is fun.
Thank you. Have a great night.
You too.